All right. I had a birthday about a month ago, and I turned 36. So I'm still a fairly young guy, and that means that my memory is still pretty good. And I remember when I turned 30. I turned 30, and we were living in Maryland. I was serving a church there, and my daughter Annabelle had just been born a few months prior to my birthday. And we were serving a little church, but it was a fun kind of a family, and it was small, and so it was really all hands on deck kind of thing. And we were blowing and going. I mean, we were up in the Baltimore D.C. corridor, where it's just ridiculously expensive. And we rented a facility in a community center, and we got it for 4 hours every Sunday. We got in at 8 o'clock, and we had to be out at noon. And so that means set up, tear down, everything. It was a good thing we were non-instrumental, because if we had instruments, we had to set all that stuff up. That would have just been a disaster. There's no way we could have done it in time, sound check and all that kind of stuff. So, it was just crazy expensive, but it was such rewarding work, and so we were having a great time. I remember 30 felt pretty good for me. And for some people, 30, like when you turn 30, it's a pretty good feeling. You're not like a new kid on the block. I mean, you're out of college, generally speaking, and your career is kind of established, and maybe family starting. Like with me, we had a kid, who'd just been born, and so you're comfortable in your own skin, and you're kind of reaching good earning potential, so you're not having to really be careful with money the way you were back when you were first married in your mid-20s. And so for a lot of people, 30 is a really good time. And then for some people, because I was reading articles today, I just typed in when you turn 30 into Google, and you'd be, the amount of bitterness that's out there. Oh. Because for some people, when you turn 30, it's a reminder of all the stuff that you're supposed to have that you don't have. You're supposed to be married by the time you're 30, and if you're not married, there are a lot of people who look at you like, what's wrong with you? And for people who are unmarried and 30, that can really alienate them, can really make you feel like a failure. You're supposed to have kids by the time you're 30, or at least be starting that process. And if you don't have kids, and a lot of people start looking at you like, what is wrong with you? And you start thinking about yourself, what is wrong with me? And the anxiety level starts to go up. You're supposed to be secure in your career by the time you're 30. And for a lot of people, especially lately, 30 is about the time you're thinking your first career change. And there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding that. And so for a lot of people, 30 is this great time of bliss and wonderful things. And for a lot of other people, 30 is just a reminder of all the stuff you were supposed to have done by now that you haven't accomplished. And so it can create a lot of anxiety in people and leave you feeling like a failure. Well, Ezekiel is who we're going to be looking at tonight. And the first sentence says, or the first phrase says, in the 30th year. My Bible has a little footnote. Anybody else have a little footnote there? All right, that little footnote is to indicate that the Hebrew word there could also be my. Not the, but my. In my 30th year. So Ezekiel, most scholars agree, Ezekiel is turning 30, has just turned 30. And we know that Ezekiel was a priest, or was supposed to be a priest, and that meant that he would have spent the majority of his life preparing to serve as a priest in the temple. But something happened. When Ezekiel was 25 years old, guess who came calling? Nebuchadnezzar. Remember when Daniel and those guys got taken away? Same thing happened to Ezekiel. Ezekiel was out with the first train because he was one of the elite. And remember we talked about that, how one of the things that an occupying nation would do is they would take all the elite, all the aristocracy out of a city because it made the city easier to manage and control. So Ezekiel was out on the first train, and they scattered people all over the place. Daniel and his friends got to go to the king's court. Ezekiel ends up at a place by the Kebar River, 700 miles away from Jerusalem. He was 25 when this happened. They're forced marched 700 miles. They get to this place, which must have just seemed like the middle of nowhere, and 5 years later, he turns 30 years old. And the reason why this is so important is because in Jerusalem, a new priest would be installed on his 30th birthday. You see, they would kind of apprentice up until that point in time, but when they turned 30, that was when they officially got to serve in the temple. And so his 30th birthday was something he would have been looking forward to his whole life. And then life interrupted at age 25. He gets carted away somewhere else, and then his birthday happens, and he's thinking, well, happy birthday to me. I mean, I'm supposed to be in Jerusalem. I'm supposed to be serving in the temple today, and here I am in the middle of nowhere, 700 miles away from the temple. It's his 30th birthday, and he's got to be thinking, if only I'd been one of the ones left behind. There were people who were left behind. Jeremiah was left behind. Why couldn't I have been like Jeremiah? If only Nebuchadnezzar hadn't invaded the city of Jerusalem when he did. If only I'd been born in a different generation. If only. You ever play that game? You ever find yourself there? Thinking, if only I lived in a different place or in a different time. If only the circumstances of I didn't do anything to deserve this. What has happened? And he's got to be thinking, what in the world is going on with my life? Because this is not how it was supposed to end up. This is not how I was supposed to turn out. By 30, I was supposed to be in a certain place, and I'm not there. And it's easy to become cynical and bitter. It's easy to be confused and discouraged. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day, while I was among the exiles by the Kebar River, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. Now, that's kind of a little reversal of fortune there. I think one of the dangers in our society is that we spend so much time running away from hardship and avoiding sad. We get sad and we just want to change it all up right now. And sometimes when we do that, we end up forfeiting a great blessing we had no idea was coming our way. But on this day, Ezekiel finds out that he's exactly where he's supposed to be. Even though he was thinking, if only I were somewhere else or some other time. It's sometimes in those places of hardship and sadness that we have these dramatic encounters with God. And only then can we gain the perspective we need to move forward. Look at verse 4. I looked up, and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal. Now, this is an interesting vision because he sees a cloud, a thunderstorm coming his way. And oftentimes in ancient literature, the victorious gods were said to be riding on the clouds. And we even have a song that we sing sometimes, "Behold, he comes riding on the clouds," because that's a picture of a victorious God. And so he's seeing this image. And now, we've talked about this before too, but let me see if I can remind you of this quickly. There was something that people in Ezekiel's time believed about gods in particular. They believed that each territory had its own god, and that a certain god only ruled a certain territory. So like when Jonah left, remember Jonah, he got in a boat and he sailed away, he probably thought, well, God can't follow me across the borders of Israel. And boy, was he surprised, because God is not bound by that kind of stuff. But this is basically what people thought. They thought there were gods, okay, and then there were people that they ruled over, and then there was dirt. God's people, dirt. That was the order of things. And they really believed that this was the sequence. And so when one people conquered another people and took away their dirt, it meant that their gods had conquered the other people's gods, you see? And so when, for example, when Nebuchadnezzar comes in and he takes away the people and he begins to occupy their dirt, people would have believed, oh, it's because the Babylonian gods beat the God of the Israelites. That's what people assumed. And one of the things that you were expected to do then in the place that had been conquered, you're supposed to take the primary temple and you were supposed to dedicate it to the other people's gods, because their God just beat your God up. That was what people were expected to do. So that's kind of what's going on here, and we'll see this as we get further into the vision that Ezekiel is given. You're supposed to make changes to your primary temple. Look at verse 5, chapter 1, verse 5. And in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was that of a man, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Go down to verse 10. Their faces looked like this. Each of the 4 had the face of a man, and on the right side, each had the face of a lion, and on the left, the face of an ox. Each also had the face of an eagle. So there are these 4 kind of block-headed characters who are there, and they have these 4 faces. And the 4 faces are the faces of what? Let's see if we can rattle these off again. One's a man. Okay, what else? There's a lion, an ox, and an eagle. There we go. Okay, so that's these 4 faces: lion, ox, man, eagle. And people have speculated on why those 4. Because these guys show up again in Revelation chapter 4. Only there it's like each one has 4 heads or something. I mean, it's a little bit more confusing, but it's the same faces, basically. And historically, Christians have identified each of these faces with one of the 4 Gospels, by the way. This is kind of, I'm not kidding. This is an interesting thing. In fact, if you go to Westminster Cathedral, you ever been to Westminster Cathedral? If you look at the pulpit at Westminster Cathedral, in the 4 corners of the pulpit are carved these 4 faces. And if you look at ancient cathedrals in stained glass windows, you'll see these faces placed in stained glass windows depicting a scene from one of the Gospels, and depending on which face is in that stained glass, it'll tell you which Gospel it's in. And basically, it's the lion is Matthew, because a lion symbolized authority, and Jesus is the Lion of Judah in the book of Matthew. The ox is typically associated with the Gospel of Mark, because the ox was very powerful and energetic, and in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is always on the move, always going, always doing these great works of power. The man is associated with the Gospel of Luke. Luke was written to what kind of audience? Does anyone remember? A Greek audience, and the Greeks were fascinated and obsessed with the perfect or ideal man, how he could relate to a lot of diverse kinds of people. And so Jesus in the Gospel of Luke is the perfect man. He's relating to such diverse groups, and he's very, very compassionate. And the eagle is associated with the Gospel of John. And a lot of times the eagle was a symbol for prophets or people who could see things from God's perspective. And Jesus is so wise, and the teachings that he gives in the Gospel of John really reflect God's perspective on things. And so typically this has nothing to do with the book of Ezekiel, by the way, but it's my favorite little piece of trivia that I thought we could waste a couple minutes on. But this is fascinating creatures here: lion, ox, man, eagle. They're kind of the 4 pinnacles of God's creation, too, because we've got wild beasts here in the lion, domesticated beasts in the ox. The eagle, of course, is the pinnacle of God's creation, and the eagle is sort of the king of the birds, kind of thing, the champion warrior bird. So they're the pinnacles of God's creation, and these are the people who are kind of carrying this vision. So look at verse 22, because between these 4 winged, 4-faced creatures, it says, spread out above the heads of the living creatures was what looked like an expanse, sparkling like ice and awesome. So there's this gap now, kind of like a platform or just a big gap. Sort of like in Genesis 1, it says there's an expanse to separate the waters above from the waters below. You guys remember that? So there's a barrier but separates what's above from what's below. Now, and in verse 26, above the expanse over their heads was what looked like a throne of sapphire, and high above, so he's kind of describing things from the bottom up. If you can, it might help to imagine like a little kid standing and trying to stare up all the way at the Washington Monument. So he's just, whoop. So he's describing this from the bottom up. And high above, on the throne, was a figure like that of a man. So above their heads was the throne, and we'll find out this is the throne of God, basically. So there's this giant throne up there. Okay, so this is quite a vision that he's got going on right here. He's got four-headed, four-faced creatures, and then he sees, if you go back to verse 15, now we all are familiar with this part here. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel. Remember Ezekiel saw the wheel? You guys heard that? Okay. So here he sees the wheel, okay? He saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its four faces. This was the appearance and structure of the wheels. They sparkled like chrysolite, and all four looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel. And as they moved, they would go in any one of the four directions the creatures faced. The wheels did not turn about as the creatures went. Their rims were high and awesome. Hang on just a second so you can get a picture of this, okay? It's like if you had one wheel facing north-south and one wheel facing east-west. You can kind of think of it like the cursor on a computer. It could go, a cursor on a computer can go up or down, or it can go left or right, but it doesn't go diagonal for some reason. And so the wheels are kind of like that. It can go in any of these four directions, which would make parallel parking really easy. You know, you just kind of go and whoop, you just right in. That would be kind of cool. And then look at verse 19. When the living creatures moved, the wheels beside them moved. And when the living creatures rose from the ground, the wheels also rose. So it could lift up and down off the ground like a helicopter. So it could lift up and hover and move in all these different directions. And so you got to ask the question, what in the world does this mean? I mean, it's bizarre, isn't it? It's a little bit strange. Well, this is basically what it means. God can go anywhere. There. That's what it means. God can go absolutely anywhere. His presence is not limited to one city or one building within the city. And that was remarkable for them. Because for them, they thought God lives in one place. God lives in the temple. Specifically, there's one room in that one building, in that one city where God lives. And he lives there, and he doesn't live anywhere else. And God is saying, hello, here I am by the Kebar River. I can go anywhere I want. I can lift up off the ground. I can go forward. I can go backward. I can go left. I can go right. I'm not bound to one specific place. And then comes something that is very biblical indeed, and it is the mixed metaphor. So look at verse 18. The wheels, their rims were high and awesome, and all four rims were full of eyes all around. Full of eyes. Now, this is kind of strange, but here's what it means. God sees everything. So God can go anywhere, and God sees everything. And usually, when we tell people God sees everything, what are we trying to do? We're trying to scare them. Right? Oh, be careful, little hands, what you do. Remember that song, right? Because the Father up above is looking down in love, but we don't really mean in love, do we? We mean he's looking down ready to spank you. Is what, he's just looking for an excuse. Don't make me come down there. Is what, so when we say, hey, look, God sees everything, usually what we're doing is we're trying to scare people. God can go anywhere. God sees everything. So be careful. Now, if you're Ezekiel, that's not how you hear this, though. Because remember where Ezekiel is. Ezekiel's just turned 30 years old. He's supposed to be serving in the temple. But he's 700 miles away from the temple, and he thinks he's in the wrong place at the wrong time. And God comes down and says, listen, I can go anywhere, and I see absolutely everything. All the discouragement and all the confusion, all the anxiety, all the fear, all the worry, I see it. All the regret, all the what-ifs, I see all that. It's got to be comforting to Ezekiel. And so when you think God sees everything, maybe it makes the fear of God jump up in you, and maybe that's appropriate, but also remember, God sees Everything. Everybody who's ever done you wrong, every good deed that went unnoticed, God sees all of that. All those anonymous acts of kindness that you do over and over and nobody says a word, God sees all that. It can be frightening, but it can also be a source of great comfort to people. Verse 26. Above the expanse over their heads was what looked like a throne of sapphire, and high above on the throne was a figure like that of a man. I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire, and that from there down he looked like fire, and brilliant lights surrounded him. Like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of one speaking. Now, anybody notice there are a couple of words and phrases that are used over and over again in those three verses? Appearance, appeared, looked like, likeness. He's not describing something very accurately. Well, it kind of looked like, well, it kind of was a little bit like, and it had the appearance of. He doesn't have words. This would be like going to see U2 in concert, and then somebody hands you a ukulele and says, "What did it sound like?" You wouldn't be able to. I don't have the tools here to show you, to communicate to you what it sounded like. It was this wall of sound, and you couldn't hear the person next to you. And it was awesome and overwhelming. That's what it would be like. And so he doesn't have words to describe exactly what it looks like. So it would be futile and pointless for us to say, well, this equals that, and the fire and the glowing metal equals that thing, because he's not using precise terms. There are no precise terms to describe what he's just seen. So let me sum up. God can go anywhere. God sees everything. There are no words to describe God accurately. There. So, when we think, well, I've got God figured out. No, you don't. Not even close. Well, I know how God operates. No, you don't. Well, if I do this, God will always do. No, he won't. That's not how God cannot be confined to a box. Well, if I say it this way in this order. No. That's not how God operates. God is a person. He's not a machine. He's not a computer. And if he's going to relate to you, he's going to relate to you on a personal level. Not on a, well, I put the quarter in, you owe me a. And that's the way the Israelites were treating him. God, you have to because we did this. Well, yeah, you did that, but your heart wasn't in it. Yeah, you kind of did it, but you kind of didn't do it. And we don't operate on this kind of quarter in, candy bar out, because this is a relationship. So, this is all going on in Ezekiel's head. There's no place God can't go. There's no thing God cannot see. And there are no words to accurately describe him. And so he gives up and he just falls flat on his face, which is the appropriate response when you're in the presence of a king. When you find yourself in the presence of a king, you were supposed to just fall flat on your face until the king says, stand up. And that's what he does. Now, 1 year later, go to chapter 8. Chapter 8, verse 1. In the 6th year, or in my 6th year, or I'm sorry, in the 6th year of the time that they've been in captivity. So in the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day, while I was sitting in my house, and the elders of Judah were sitting before me, the hand of the sovereign Lord came upon me there. I looked, and I saw a figure like that of a man. From what appeared to be his waist down, he was like fire, and from there up, his appearance was as bright as glowing metal. He stretched out what looked like a hand and took me by the hair of my head. The Spirit, and by the way, when you encounter God, it's not always like fun and games, okay? It's not always, oh God, I just wish I could feel your presence, because it's not always something you want to feel. Sometimes he'll grab you by the hair of your head and lift you up, and that's not a very pleasant experience. Okay, so he stretched out what looked like a hand, took me by the hair of my head. The Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven, and in visions of God, he took me to Jerusalem, to the entrance, to the north gate of the inner court, where the idol that provokes to jealousy stood. And there before me was the glory of the God of Israel, as in the vision I had seen in the plain. Now, big question, why is there an idol there? Anyone want to guess? Why would there be an idol there? Because of this, remember? Because the Babylonians had taken over. And so in the temple in Jerusalem, the main temple, you're supposed to dedicate that temple to the other people's gods. So now there's a big statue in there, a big idol, because that's what you're supposed to do. So they put a big idol in there. And this is interesting. Throughout the history of Israel, people never totally gave up on God. They just added other gods to him. They never absolutely gave up on Jehovah. They just added other gods into the mix and thought, well, I mean, Yahweh is good and all, but Yahweh can always use a little help, and two are better than one, so let's have 2 gods, or 5, or 15 gods, and Yahweh will be our primary God, but there will be all these other gods as well. And so that's kind of what they've done. They would do that, and then they had the nerve to say, well, Jerusalem will never fall because the temple is there. And in the temple, in that one room in the temple is where God lives. And as long as God lives there and we have that one room in that one building, then the whole city will stand. Even though they're doing all this other stuff. And that was really what they believed. And that's what they, in fact, Jeremiah talks a lot about that, because that was what they were saying to Jeremiah. Now, verse 12, chapter 8, verse 12. He said to me, God said to me, Son of man, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel are doing in the darkness, each at the shrine of his own idol? They say, the Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land. Remember a couple of weeks ago I told you that story about Annabelle when we were in Texas, and Annabelle got this idea in her head when she was about 2.5 that if she couldn't see you, you couldn't see her. And so she would dump out all the books. She had this little basket in her room that we kept books in, and she would dump all the books out, and she would put the basket over her head, and she would wander out of her room in the middle of the night, headed for the kitchen trying to find a cookie, because she thought if she couldn't see you, you couldn't see her. And we would just laugh ourselves silly, and we have a picture of it, and it's absolutely adorable when they're 2.5. But if they're 17 and they're still doing that, call a shrink, because that's not, And yet I see people all the time who believe if I can't see God, God can't see me. And because they can't see God now, they're thinking, well, God doesn't see what we're doing here. We're doing it in secret. We're doing it in the dark over here, for crying out loud. Of course, God can't see in the dark. God can't see through walls. God can't see through... God's got eyes all over the place. Ezekiel knows. There's no place God can't go. There's no thing God doesn't see. So, these people are saying that God doesn't see us. And Ezekiel knows God's not bound to one building. And look at verse 18. Therefore, God is speaking, I will deal with them in anger. I will not look on them with pity or spare them. Although they shout in my ears, I will not listen to them. The truth is, God keeps his word. Remember back in Deuteronomy 28, God told them, listen, if you obey the commands, all these blessings will happen to you. And if you don't, all of these curses and bad things will happen to you. And the amazing thing about God is, he keeps his word. Now, normally, when we say that to people, unlike when we say God sees everything, when we say God keeps his word, usually we do that to try to offer people comfort, don't we? But Ezekiel sees this and remembers, the good news is God keeps his word. The bad news is God keeps his word. And so we got to be really careful. Let me just say this, because I hear preachers all the time who pull Deuteronomy 28 out. Look at all this stuff that happens to God's people. And I'm like, don't look at the second half of the chapter. We got to be really careful before we appropriate that to us, because God keeps His word. And if I'm not sure I want to sign that contract, because that's not a covenant I can keep, and I don't want all those curses coming my way. God keeps His word. And for those of us who are in the new covenant, one of the things that means is God says, if you reject me, I will reject you. But if you acknowledge me, I will acknowledge you. The good news is God keeps His word. And the bad news is God keeps His word. He doesn't do it to be mean. He doesn't do it to be vindictive. He does it because He has integrity. And when God says He's going to do something, He is going to do it. Look at chapter 10. Ezekiel chapter 10. Verse 4. Now this, if what Ezekiel had seen so far had just been overwhelming, but this is outrageous. Chapter 10, verse 4. Then the glory of the Lord rose from above the cherubim and moved to the threshold of the temple. He's at the doorway of the temple now. And the cloud filled the temple, and the court was full of the radiance of the glory of the Lord. But God is leaving the temple. He's on His way out the door. And the question is, where in the world is He going? Because this is where you're supposed to be, God. You're supposed to live in this room, in this building, and God gets up and He walks to the door. Where are you going, God? Go over to chapter 11 and we'll find out. Chapter 11, verse 22. God's up on His moving platform and it starts to go. Then the cherubim with the wheels beside them spread their wings, and the glory of the God of Israel was above them. The glory of the Lord went up from within the city and stopped above the mountain east of it. The glory of God leaves the temple, then it leaves the city, and it ends up hanging out on a mountain east of the city limits. Now, what is the significance of this for Ezekiel and his people back there at the Kebar River? Well, they thought, we're missing out on God because we're not in Jerusalem. If only we could go back to Jerusalem, then we could really have this relationship with God. And God is saying, I don't even live there anymore. Sometimes we're so nostalgic for the way things used to be. Oh, if we could only go back there. Only come to find out, God's moved on. God's outside of the city. He doesn't even live there anymore. He's abandoned that place. But, interestingly enough, He hasn't abandoned His promises or His people, especially the 10,000 people living at the Kebar River. Chapter 11, verse 16. Therefore say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Although I sent them far away among the nations and scattered them among the countries, yet for a little while I have been a sanctuary for them in the countries where they have gone. Not, I have hung out here in Jerusalem waiting for them to return, but I actually went out there and was a sanctuary for them in the countries where they have gone. Therefore say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will gather you from the nations and bring you back from the countries where you've been scattered, and I will give you back the land of Israel again. They will return to it and remove all its vile images and detestable idols. I will give them an undivided heart and put a new spirit in them. I will remove from them their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. And then they will follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. They will be my people, and I will be their God. Talk about an amazing reversal of fortune for Ezekiel. He thought he was missing out, being 700 miles away from the center of activity. He come to find out he's in the center of activity. God was not waiting for them to return to Him. God came out looking for them, because that's the kind of God He is. And by the way, interestingly enough, God didn't abandon everyone in Jerusalem. Remember we talked about this a couple of months ago, that after the temple was destroyed, Jeremiah is walking through the ashes and the rubble, and he writes the book of Lamentations, and he says that God's mercies are new every morning. And he knows that like a phoenix rising from the ashes, God is going to rebuild this city. And so God hasn't abandoned everyone in Jerusalem. God is with Jeremiah in Jerusalem. Oh, and by the way, God is also with Daniel and his 3 buddies in Babylon, in the city of Babylon, in the king's court there. And God is also working on King Nebuchadnezzar. He's working on his heart, drawing him to himself. And God is with Ezekiel and these 10,000 people by the Kebar River. That's the amazing thing about God. He's a great multitasker. He can carry on a number of different conversations and keep projects going in different parts of the world. And we think we've got God locked up here in this building or in this book. God's in this book. Don't let him out. Whoop. I'll let him out a little bit at a time. Whoop. Or God is way, way out there somewhere way far away in heaven up above beyond the azure blue. No. God is here. And God is there. And God is over there in that building. That building? Yes. But they don't have the right name. That's okay. God can be there too. God knows where he is and what he's doing and where he can be and who he can operate with. God knows this stuff. We think we've got God limited, bound up, chained up. We keep him in one room in our place. And God says it doesn't work like that. I decide where I go and when I go and how far I go. I determine the boundaries. God can work in Jerusalem. God can work in Babylon. God can work in Kebar River. God works in Dunwoody, in Alpharetta, in Nashville, in New York City, in Las Vegas, in San Francisco, in Hollywood. God works among amazingly diverse places and amazingly diverse people. Last weekend, I was with a church in Santa Rosa, California, up in Sonoma County. Absolutely beautiful place. The guy who leads this church is an amazing guy. He was raised in the United Methodist Church, and he went to seminary, and he was pastoring a United Methodist Church in the San Francisco Bay Area. And about 8 years ago, the United Methodist Church in California decided to start doing same-sex marriages. And that was something that he just couldn't reconcile with his own conscience. And so he left the United Methodist Church, the only church he'd ever been a part of, the church he had invested his whole life and career in. He's in his early 30s with a young family, and he decides, I can't do this. I got to leave. So he parts ways with the United Methodist Church in California, in that part of the country. And he looks around and he finds a church in Sonoma County, California, one of the lowest churched populations. About 6% of the population there attend church anywhere. So 400,000 people, 6% of them attend church anywhere. He finds a church, a Baptist church. First Baptist Church was 100 years old, and there were 85 people in there. Some of them were original members. Everybody was between the ages of 45 and 75, and there are 85 of them. And they're dying. I mean, the church is dying. And he realizes something's got to change or I'm out of a job. And this lighthouse goes away. And so he decides, I'm going to cut ties with the Baptist church. We're going to go completely locally autonomous, community church, whatever. We're going to take the organ out. And some of the people said, if you take the organ out, we'll leave. And he said, are you going to leave God? And they said, no, we're just going to leave you in this building. And he said, well, that's okay. You don't have to be in this building with me in order to be with God. So wherever you go, go ahead. And they all laughed. And he has about a dozen of those original people left. And their church, 4 years later, is right at 1,000 people. God works among amazingly diverse people in amazingly diverse places. In an outpost in Sonoma County, California, God is doing amazing things. God is doing amazing things in China, where it's illegal to give a Bible to your brother. And people are coming to Christ like nobody's business. In India, some of the most impoverished places on earth, God is doing amazing works in diverse, and we think we've got him. We've got him right here. We've got him all taken care of. We know where he lives. We know how he operates. And God is saying, God's going to come up and tap us on the shoulder. And what are you doing back there? We thought you were over here. God is on the loose, and He is doing amazing things. He is not bound by geography or buildings. He is on the loose, and He is always at work. Now, 20 years after the first vision, Ezekiel is 50 years old now. 50 years old, and now God speaks again. Go to chapter 40. God gives him a vision of a new temple. And it's enormous. It's massive. It doesn't measure in feet or in yards. It measures in miles now. And the size of this temple is emphasized repeatedly. And he goes into great detail, the measurements of every wall and every gate. And we won't take time to read it now because it's so detailed. But the bottom line is it's huge, bigger than anything anyone had ever envisioned before. Look at chapter 43, verse 2. This is great. He says, I saw the glory of the God of Israel coming from the east, the direction it had gone out. Now it's coming from the east. His voice was like that of the roar of rushing waters, and the land was radiant with His glory. The vision I saw was like the vision I had seen when He came to destroy the city, and like the visions I had seen by the Kebar River, and I fell face down. And the glory of the Lord entered the temple through the gate facing east. And then the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. Ezekiel, so discouraged, so confused. And then he saw God, and he realized there's nowhere God can't go, and there's no thing that God doesn't see, and there are no words to adequately describe Him. And God shows him, listen, for a while, my work isn't exclusively going to be focused on the temple. For a time, for 70 years, my work is going to be focused on the people in the east, near the Kebar River. Because God can handle it if His people are scattered all over the place. But what's God ultimately doing? We talk about this over and over again. What's He ultimately doing? He's building a community. And so ultimately He's going to gather them back together again. One day God will gather His people together in one place, in a new temple, in a new Jerusalem. And it'll be unlike the previous temple. Because the scale is so big, the city of Jerusalem would never be able to contain it. And people are going to gather there from every nation and every tribe and every tongue. Everybody who will turn from idols and seek the one true God will be welcome into His new temple in the new Jerusalem. And sometimes you feel like you're in the right place at the wrong time. That probably was Jeremiah. I'm in Jerusalem, but the whole thing's been reduced to an ash heap. And then there are times when you feel like you're in a wrong place at the right time. And that had to be Ezekiel on his 30th birthday. It's the right time, God, but I'm 700 miles away. But let me tell you something. The right place is always wherever God is at work. And the right time is always now. We spend so much time focused on the way things used to be. But the amazing thing is, the only day God never works on is yesterday. Yesterday has happened. God can redeem it, but He's going to redeem it today. He's not going to fly backwards around the world like Superman and rewind it so that you can be in 6th grade again and undo that thing that you did. You did it, and now He's going to work on today, and He's going to work on your tomorrow, and He's going to work on your future. He's not going to work on your past. Let it go. God's moved on. When Jesus came to His followers, He didn't say, you know what, let's just sit real still and stay right here. He said, come on, let's go. Follow me. Here we go. Come on, are you following me? Let's go. It's hard to stay where you are and follow Jesus at the same time. And I've known churches who got really, really big, and they thought, we've got this whole thing figured out. This church will never die because God is here. And I go visit some of those big, big churches that built these huge auditoriums back in the day. And there sit 300 people in a 3,000-seat auditorium. You've seen them. I've seen them. Go to Europe sometime And look at them there. Big, giant cathedrals where they get more tourists coming through than they have people that meet there for church. Churches, local churches, come and go. But God is always at work. And our job is to keep our eyes open and be willing to join Him in His work rather than insisting that He join us in ours. And that's why I have so much respect for this guy that I met out in California, because he saw where God was at work and he cut ties. He had to sacrifice. I mean, there was family stuff in that and there was career stuff in that, and he sacrificed it to go where God was at work. If you understand Ezekiel, you understand the whole story of the Bible. The whole story of the Bible begins in a garden. And that garden is God's place. And Adam and Eve enjoyed the presence and the blessings of God there. And God would come down and He'd walk with them in the cool of the garden. But they chose to turn away from Him. And as a result, they were thrown out of God's place. Anyone remember the direction they went in? East. They went to the east. They were thrown out. And the place of God was destroyed. Eden doesn't exist anymore. We can't find it anywhere. So the place was destroyed. And they were thrown out and taken to the east, just like the Israelites who were taken into captivity 700 miles to the northeast. But God didn't abandon Adam and Eve. And He didn't stay put in the garden saying, one of these days they'll find their way back to me. Instead, God came looking for them. He goes, He takes the initiative, He seeks us out, and He makes Himself available to us. And He promises one day to gather us all back together in a place that is bigger and better than the original. And you roll the clock forward 600 years after this whole vision. Jerusalem's been rebuilt. There's a new temple. And Jesus showed up. And the writer of Hebrews describes Jesus as the radiance of God's glory. The Apostle John says, we beheld His glory, the glory of the one and only Son of God. And God came to discouraged and confused people in a backwater town that was occupied by a foreign army. And those people must have been wondering, what in the world is God doing? And one day, the radiance of God's glory went into the temple. And there were animals everywhere. And there was idolatry being practiced. The whole place needed to be cleaned out. And so the glory of God swept through the temple and cleaned it out. And then the glory of God stood in the temple of God. And for days on end, He talked and He taught about the things of God. And those people who for years had said, no, God is only here and God is only for us, had to deal with the fact that all of a sudden God was having dinner with hookers and tax collectors and lawyers. But the people didn't want Him. And so the glory of God left the temple. But this time it wasn't riding on a moving platform. This time it was not escorted by 4 cherubim, 4 angels. This time it was escorted by guards with swords and clubs. And the glory of God left Jerusalem, carrying a cross. And it went out of the temple. It went out of the city gates. And on a hill just outside of town, the glory of God hovered for several hours on a Friday afternoon. He was crucified, and He died for the sins of the world. And 3 days later, the grave couldn't keep Him back, and He rose from the dead. And for 40 days, He taught His followers about what the kingdom of God would be like and how they could advance the borders of that kingdom in their generation. And then He went to another hill east of the city called the Mount of Olives, which may very well be the exact place that Ezekiel had seen in his vision. And while he was there talking to his disciples, the radiance of the glory of God ascended back to the throne that Ezekiel had seen 600 years earlier. And the disciples stood there and looked into the sky. We don't know how long they stood there. But we know eventually 2 angels had to come down and say, "What are you doing? Why are you staring into the sky like that? You saw him leave. You better understand he's going to come back. And he's going to want to know if you did what he said to do. So go on, get on with it." He returned to heaven, and he will return to gather us together again. And that is where human history is one day headed. Only on that day, we'll go one better than Adam and Eve. And we'll go one better than Ezekiel. Because Ezekiel saw something that might have kind of looked like the appearance. And we'll actually see him face to face. The glory of God came, lived among us, died for us, rose from the dead to secure our security, our destiny, a place with God and with God's people. And that's what this weekend is all about. And it's the fulfillment of that vision that Ezekiel had 600 years before Jesus. Let's pray. God, we long for the day where we see you face to face. And with the saints of old, we cry, "Maranatha, Lord, come quickly." Because we live in confusing and discouraging times. We live in scary places, some of us. And our lives are consumed with pettiness and things that drain us. We long to be at home with you forever. And so we cry, "Maranatha, Lord, come quickly." But until you do, make us brave and bold, courageous, and energetic enough to go out and do the things you have called us to do, to keep our eyes open to see where you are at work, and our hearts and our minds open to join you in your work rather than insisting that you join us in ours. God, thank you for your servant Ezekiel. But thank you more for Jesus, who was the glory of God. And we thank you that all of your promises are yes in him, and that there is no condemnation for those of us who are in him, and that one day we will be like him. And we pray that that day may be today. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. We'll see you next week.